Final warning. Something surprising will happen in the financial life of those who apply these principles. Napoleon Hill. Let me tell you something that almost no one has the courage to say. Not everyone is born to prosper, but everyone can learn to align themselves, and that's where most people get lost. People spend their whole lives chasing money, opportunities, and shortcuts, without realizing that the biggest financial obstacle isn't outside, it's inside. It sounds strange, I know, but the truth is that financial life changes in silence, not in noise. It changes when you adjust your mind before trying to adjust the numbers. Perhaps you've already done everything right. You worked hard, you made an effort, you tried to save money, you sought to learn more. Even so, something always gets in the way. And here's the controversial part. The harder you push, the further away the result becomes. Prosperity doesn't respond to haste, it responds to alignment. That's why two people with the same salary live completely different realities. One lives in tension, the other in clarity. One runs, the other moves forward. What if I told you there's a precise point at which your financial life begins to reorganize itself almost on its own? Not by miracle, not by luck, but because you've changed the way you think, decide, and sustain results. Napoleon Hill called this invisible preparation. And the curious thing is, this process doesn't attract the attention of those who are distracted. It only works for those who are willing to listen with intention, not with anxiety. If you've made it this far, it's probably no coincidence. Perhaps this is the moment to understand why some people thrive without making a fuss, while others tire themselves out trying. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to hear isn't just another financial piece of advice. It's a mindset shift that can completely change your relationship with money, time, and decisions. The silent mistake that blocks your financial life. Before the money. You've probably been taught to believe that your financial life changes when money comes in. But here's something counterintuitive. Money only obeys after the mind is organized. Most people chase after income, opportunities, and results, but ignore the invisible point where it all begins. It's like trying to turn up the volume with the radio off. Nothing happens. When the mind is in conflict, financial life reflects exactly that internal noise, even if you work hard and do everything right. Perhaps you've already experienced this without realizing it. You might even earn more at certain times, but then unexpected expenses, bad decisions, or impulsive choices quickly arise. This isn't bad luck. It's a misaligned mental pattern. Napoleon Hill explained that prosperity follows alignment. It's not blind effort. When your financial decisions stem from anxiety, money comes in through the front door and goes out the back, as if it were never enough. Here's the point that almost no one teaches. Financial life is more a result of your relationship with time than your talent. When you live in a rush, trying to solve everything now, you end up choosing shortcuts that cost you dearly later. It's at this moment that a wealth mindset begins to be built or sabotaged. And before any visible change happens, something needs to change in the way you think, react, and decide, especially when no one is watching. But this raises a silent question. If the problem isn't money, then where exactly does the turnaround begin? The invisible power of small decisions, where prosperity begins. You may not realize it, but your financial life isn't built on big decisions. It's born from small, seemingly harmless choices. It's there, in everyday life, that wealth mindset. It is trained or sabotaged. When you postpone something simple, when you spend to alleviate emotion, when you avoid looking at numbers because of discomfort, the subconscious, it registers this as a pattern. And repeated patterns create predictable results, even when you truly desire abundance and prosperity. Here's a point that's rarely discussed. Money respects consistency, not rhetoric. You can claim you want to grow financially, but if your micro decisions don't support that, the flow stalls. Napoleon Hill already said that financial results follow invisible habits before they follow plans. A simple example? People who prosper tend to pay important bills first, even when it's tight, because they understand alignment as a priority. Nothing is left over. And there's something even more subtle about all of this. When you start aligning small decisions with intention, something changes internally. The rush decreases, clarity increases, and faith. It stops being an expectation and becomes a stance. You stop reacting and start choosing. It seems like a small thing, but it's precisely at this point that your financial life begins to reorganize itself from within. And this prepares the ground for a bigger decision that almost no one is ready to make. Why haste drives money away, and calmness attracts opportunities. There's a silent trap that almost everyone falls into at some point, thinking that if you speed things up, your financial life will respond faster. But the exact opposite happens. When you live in urgency mode, your decisions become reactive, not strategic. It's like driving while only looking in the rearview mirror and still flooring it. Your mind thinks you're moving forward, but alignment, it was already lost back there, in the impulse that nobody saw. Perhaps you've felt this before. That urge to get it over with quickly, to accept any offer, to get involved in something just because it seems like a unique opportunity. The problem isn't acting, it's acting without clarity. Prosperity doesn't like desperation disguised as courage. When haste takes over the subconscious, he understands that there is scarcity, and everything that comes from that place carries the same code. That's why so much effort generates little return in certain phases. Now, observe something curious. People who consistently build abundance don't chase money. They position themselves. They know how to wait patiently, act without anxiety, and say no without guilt. This requires faith, but not that passive faith, but rather an active trust in the right timing. When you slow down internally, you begin to notice opportunities that previously went unnoticed. And this opens up space for a different kind of choice, a choice that completely changes the game. The moment you stop asking and start attracting. There comes a point where your financial life changes not because you tried harder, but because stopped begging for results. It's subtle, almost imperceptible. You keep working, you keep learning, but something internal adjusts. Your posture changes. Your tone changes. Wealth mindset. It ceases to be a desire and becomes a state of being. When this happens, money begins to respond differently, as if it recognizes coherence where there was previously tension. Many people confuse faith with passive waiting, but here's a principle that's rarely discussed. Prosperity draws near to those who trust without remaining passive. You don't accept just anything. You don't jump into everything. You don't react to every opportunity. You observe. You choose. Napoleon Hill spoke about this when explaining that the right opportunities require inner preparation, not anxiety. Subconscious, you need to be trained to recognize what makes sense. In practice, this manifests itself in simple ways. You start saying no to expenses that previously seemed harmless. You avoid financial decisions made to please, impress, or compensate for emotions. And, without realizing it, you create alignment between what you think, feel, and do. It is at this point that abundance ceases to be something distant and begins to become a natural consequence, but something essential is still missing, something that separates those who improve financially from those who truly level up. The internal standard that defines how much you can afford to support. Few people talk about it, but the truth is simple. It's not how much money you earn, it's how much you can support yourself without sabotaging yourself. There are people who even access prosperity at certain times, but soon lose control, focus, or peace. not because they are incapable, but because their internal pattern has not yet been adjusted. Subconscious. He always pulls reality back to the level he considers safe, even if that level is uncomfortable. Perhaps you recognize this cycle. When everything starts to go right, a strange restlessness arises. Impulsive spending, hasty decisions, unnecessary distractions. This isn't just a lack of discipline, it's a lack of alignment. Internally, this has reached a new level. Napoleon Hill explained that the mind needs to be trained to accept abundance before it becomes permanent. Otherwise, the individual creates mechanisms to revert to the familiar. This is where the faith it matures, not as a hope that something will work out, but as confidence that you can sustain what is coming. When this pattern changes, you stop being afraid of growth. Money ceases to be an emotional burden and becomes a neutral tool. And it is precisely at this point that something different begins to take shape. Because those who learn to sustain inevitably prepare themselves to receive more. When financial life changes without making a sound, there's a curious moment in every true financial turnaround. Nothing explodes on the outside, but everything gets organized on the inside. There's no euphoria, no announcement, no feeling of, now it's going to happen. What emerges is clarity. You begin to realize that you think differently, react differently, and choose differently. Wealth mindset. It stops being something you study and becomes something you live, almost without realizing it. Perhaps you're already at that point now. Comparisons have decreased, the urgency has faded, and that need to prove something has simply grown tiresome. This is a sign of alignment. Money starts to flow more easily when you're not trying to impress anyone or compensate for emotional voids with unnecessary consumption or risk-taking. Subconscious. He understands that he no longer needs to sabotage, because internal control has been assumed. Napoleon Hill said that true growth happens away from the noise, in the territory of conscious silence. It is there that prosperity. It is structured in a solid way, without shocks, without sudden losses. When you become stable inside, reality responds with stability on the outside. And this silent phase usually precedes something bigger. Something that only those who have learned to observe before acting perceive. A clear sign that something surprising has already begun. There is a silent sign that almost no one recognizes, but that always appears before a real financial change. You stop begging for answers and start trusting the process. It's not conformity, it's maturity. You still act, you still move, but without that internal tension that drained your energy, wealth mindset. It becomes solidified when anxiety relinquishes control, and clarity takes the wheel. Perhaps you've noticed this recently. Decisions that once seemed confusing now become simpler. Not because everything is resolved, but because you've learned to listen before acting. Subconscious. Cooperation arises when coherence is perceived between thought, emotion, and action. And when this happens, financial life begins to align without requiring extra effort, as if the pieces are finally finding their right place. This is the point where the faith, it stops being an expectation and becomes a daily attitude. You don't force opportunities, you don't chase after everything, you don't blame yourself for the timing of things. This creates space for something surprising to happen. Not as a shock, but as a perfect fit. And when that fit begins, an inevitable question arises. What can be done to avoid interrupting this movement and allow it to continue growing? What not to do when your finances start to get organized? When things start to fall into place financially, the most common mistake is trying to speed up the process for fear of missing out. That's precisely where many people sabotage themselves without realizing it. The desire to take advantage while it lasts, to take unnecessary risks, or to change everything at once may seem like courage, but it's usually disguised anxiety. Wealth mindset. A true investor knows when it's time to consolidate, not to expand at any cost. Perhaps you've seen this happen before. A person starts earning more. A feeling of relief arises, and soon higher expenses, unnecessary commitments, or decisions made to maintain a certain image appear. Subconscious. When not fully trained, it tries to test the limits of the new pattern. And it is in this test that prosperity it can slip through your fingers, not for lack of opportunity, but for lack of alignment internal. Napoleon Hill warned that sustainable growth requires respecting one's own pace. It's not the time to prove anything, it's time to sustain. Maintaining simple habits, clear decisions, and a healthy relationship with money at this stage is what protects progress. And when you learn what know by doing so, you begin to understand something even deeper. There is a specific attitude that keeps the door open to the next level. The final principle: why few reach the end of the process. Here's a principle that almost no one accepts at first. Most people abandon the process just when it starts to work. Not because something went wrong, but because the ego craves quick signals, external validation, and applause. When financial life enters a phase of real adjustment, it demands consistency, not excitement. Wealth. Mindset: you mature when you continue doing the right thing even without witnesses. This might sound strange, but it's at this point that many people get distracted. They stop observing their own patterns, relax on the details, and revert to acting on autopilot, subconscious. It responds quickly to this change in attitude and begins, little by little, to dismantle what was being built. Prosperity is not fragile, but it demands continuous consistency. It's not enough to understand, it needs to be sustained. Napoleon Hill said that few succeed not because of a lack of ability, but because of a lack of perseverance. When you decide to go all the way, even quietly, something becomes firmly established. Faith. Here, it's not about waiting for something to happen, it's about staying aligned even after the anxiety goes away. And when this principle is integrated, what comes next no longer depends on luck. It depends on continuity. The decision that determines whether or not this changes your life. Now let me ask you a direct question. Without beating around the bush, what are you going to do with all that you've just heard? Because knowledge alone changes nothing. What changes life is the moment you decide to apply it. Even without applause, even without immediate guarantees, even without someone validating it. The financial turnaround doesn't happen when you understand more. It happens when you start acting differently in small decisions every day. Look at your own routine. Where do you still act out of haste? Where do you decide out of anxiety? Where are you trying to force results instead of sustaining processes? Prosperity begins when you choose coherence over urgency, when you learn to say no to what drains you and yes to what builds you up. It's not about doing everything at once, it's about not abandoning the path when silence appears. Now think about it. What would your financial life be like a year from now if you maintained this alignment every day? Less noise, more clarity. Less impulse, more strategy. Less comparison, more focus. What you heard here wasn't fleeting motivation. It was an invitation to change your mindset. And only those who change their mindset can change their lives. If this resonated with you, don't let this moment pass by like just another video. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep learning how to think, decide, and act in a way that truly builds prosperity. And now tell me in the comments, what was the point that affected you the most today? This answer could be the first step in your change.